Thank you everyone for coming here tonight. My name's Ariadne Vromen. I'm a Professor of Public Administration at the Australian National University, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how tonight's going to work and how we see this as a really important and productive conversation about how deliberative Australian democracy is and could be or should be. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're together today on the lands of the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and warmly welcome any First Nations people in the room with us tonight. So this event is hosted by the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. For over a decade now, the Centre has conducted rigorous and influential research on how democracies around the world can foster inclusive, informed and impactful conversations that shape the political decisions affecting our lives. I've known the Centre for the whole of its life and all of the people who work in it, and they are international leaders in their research and thinking and provocations of how we need to think about doing democracy better. And we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Centre's life at the University of Canberra. And this is also the capstone event for a series of events the Centre's been holding throughout the year to promote international discussion about deliberative democracy and really focus on some of the big questions. I think we Canberrans, I guess I'm kind of a Canberran now as well, can take real pride in that we have this internationally leading centre here in the ACT that really is at the forefront of how we reimagine democracy to work better for all of us. So tonight we're going to focus on how deliberative is Australian democracy. So we're all on the same page. Here we mean deliberative in quite a broad sense, as a conversation that we can think about how we have an informed, reflective and inclusive discussion about democracy. And how we can think about how we can make collective decisions that are based on being informed, reflective and inclusive of other people. So tonight's going to work. The first half, we're going to talk about the research of my three megastar friends sitting here, and then they're going to tell us about their latest research and thinking, which is incredibly diverse and exciting. And in the second half of the discussion, we're going to really try and come to grips with that question about what can be done to make democracy more deliberative and inclusive in Australia. And then in the third bit, we'll come back and we'll do some question and answers from the audience as well. So make sure you're thinking of your questions in advance. I'm going to go across the row with some questions to really draw out a sense of what my colleagues have been thinking about. So my first question is going to go to Professor Selen Ercan. Selen is the Director of the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at Canberra Uni, and she's been doing a variety of research projects on deliberative democracy in Australia. So Selen, give us a sense of what your observations have been from your research.
Thanks, Ariadne. Wonderful to be here, thrilled to be here today. I've been working in the field of deliberative democracy for over 15 years now. And I guess my observations sort of compared to deliberative democracy now versus 15, 20 years ago, I observed definitely a rise in the interest on deliberative democracy, deliberative forms of citizen engagement, innovative forms of citizen engagement. Sometimes this interest comes from the desire to address the issues, challenges we face in our representative democracies. For example, the trust deficit, the disconnect between everyday citizens and their elected representatives. Sometimes this interest comes from just curiosity, just to intention to do things, to explore different way of engaging communities and publics. But definitely what I see is a growing interest in deliberative forms of citizen engagement. I guess when I look at Australian democracy, the question then whether this interest translates in the practice, whether we see the practice of deliberative democracy as well. And I think here we have a lot of good news to share as well based on the research we've been doing at our center. And particularly, I think it comes down to the individual champions of deliberative democracy. We've been, for example, working with politicians, with elected representatives, and I think they could be really good advocates and individual champions of deliberative forms of citizen engagement. We did, for example, a couple of years ago, we organized some deliberative town halls with the elected representative, Dr. Andrea Lee, bringing him together with a group of randomly selected citizens, both in online and in-person context. And the discussion, the deliberative practice there was on a very complex moral issue on mitochondrial donation. And these kind of practices really show that deliberative practice actually is not just an ideal. It can have a role in practice. It can apply to real life context and problems. But of course, what I observe is that it requires individual champions. Like, for example, in our case, the MP that we worked with was interested in deliberative forms of citizen engagement. So it was practiced and it was a successful example. So I don't see an institutional opening for deliberative forms of engagement, but there's a lot of individual intention and individual politicians, organizations wanting to open up their way of making decisions to broader publics and wanting to make their governance more deliberative.
It's a really important point. We're at this sort of, some people might see as a crisis in democracy. So that focus on finding the champions who are open enough to do practices and do the thinking in a fundamentally different way that challenges the way of things is really, really important. I know you've also been working a bit, not just with politicians, but through the centre also increasingly with the public service, and see that the public sector itself might be able to be a space where we can think more deliberatively and bring citizens more into the policy process. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I guess my observations could be biased because we are working people who are coming, who are reaching out to us, who already have some interest in deliberative forms of citizen engagement. So our centre has been collaborating with the New South Wales Government's Department of Premier and Connected Communities Unit for a couple of years now on several projects. And together with many others at the centre, we produced a comprehensive guidebook on deliberative engagement. And this is like more than 100 pages long. It's not because we have a lot to tell, but there are a lot of examples, and I see a lot of interest in examples, not only what's going on in Australia, but what could Australia learn from other successful examples of deliberative engagement. So we are launching this guidebook, and it will be a resource for public servants, initially for New South Wales, but could be used across Australia as well, to how to design, implement, and evaluate these kind of practices. And this experience has been very eye-opening for me, because when you think about public servants, and apologies if there are public servants in the room, but you sort of think maybe they are not so much interested in deliberative engagement. Maybe we need to target politicians. But our collaboration with a wonderful group of public servants in New South Wales was very, very eye-opening, and we've learned a lot from them as well. And I think it is, again, I see public servants as champions of deliberative forms of engagement too. And I'm hoping the guidebook, which took us such a long time to put together, because we also wanted to translate our research ideas into actionable insights, practical guidance. There was a lot of translation work involved in the context of the guidebook, and talk to public servants as well to identify pressing issues and identify areas where deliberative engagement can bring something new and offer some innovative solutions to some of the problems. I really hope that the guidebook inspires others as well who are interested in the practice of deliberative democracy. But these two examples, working both with MPs and public servants in the Australian context, were very positive experiences for me, which I think made me optimistic about the future of deliberative democracy in Australia.
No, that's great. The times are right for the work that you've been doing for a long time. I'm going to go a little bit off script, but to make a bit more tangible the kinds of deliberative examples that you're talking about. I mean, there are citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries, various kind of mini publics. We could talk about kitchen table conversations. There are a range of deliberative mechanisms. Are there ones that particularly appealed to the public servants you were working with, or are there particular international examples that they really became excited about?
I feel like, again, this is my personal observation.
You're the expert, Selen.
Okay,
It's
so there's an increasing interest in trying to understand what can be done online, because I think online spaces are sort of low cost, so barriers are not that high, you can reach out to lots of people. So there is, and any kind of deliberative engagement can be done online, and it's, I guess, different kind of discussion what happens to deliberative quality. That's a research question, but I get a sense of there's a lot of intention to learn about the online forms of deliberative engagement, and there are some very effective online forms of deliberative democracy and deliberative engagement in general. But I guess also partly the reason our guidebook is more than 100 pages long, it has a library of different methods of deliberative engagement. What people in practice, politicians or public servants, what they want to know is that, okay, there is an issue and maybe I don't have 1 year to plan ahead. So what can I do quickly that still has some sort of quality, deliberative quality? So we have in the guidebook, for example, for each method we are providing some advice when to use them and not to use them, because I think it's also important about which method you are using. You can't just parachute the same method and use it across different kind of areas, or you can't just take something that worked in another context, in another democracy, to the Australian context. So there's a lot of thinking around the design, and I guess we are sort of following some of our colleagues in Europe. We are defining deliberative design. Designing deliberative engagement is not a technocratic fix, but it's a craft. So you have to think about the context and decide on the best design accordingly.
I think that's really, really important for us to think about, that it's not just the quick fix to trust deficits or other kinds of problems such as, we see on social media all the time. It really is how do we sort of craft something that's very context specific and works for the kinds of people that you want to bring in and engage in deliberation. So thanks, Selen, for giving us a sense of that. And I'm sure we can send everyone the link to the engagement handbook once it comes out. Sounds fantastic. So I'm going to turn to Adele now. Dr. Adele Webb is a researcher on democracy and citizen engagement at the Centre at the University of Canberra. And along with her colleagues, she's just completed a national survey on how citizens think about deliberation and their attitudes towards it. So tell us about your findings, Adele.
Yeah, thanks, Ariadne. And just to reiterate the point that Selen's making, that I think it is really important to have individual champions of innovations in our democracy. We can't do it without that. At the same time, I think the research question that I've been looking at is really about, well, what about the wider public in Australia? Do they support more deliberation in our democracy? And just to give you a cheat sheet answer, the short answer to that is yes, and I'll tell you a bit about my findings in a second to give some evidence behind that claim. But before I do, I think I just want to sort of set the scene a little bit about how things currently work. So, as you would know, in our democracy currently, there are quite a limited number of ways that we can participate. In fact, for most people, participation in politics equals voting in an election every couple of years. We call that thin participation. At the same time, for various reasons, our parliamentary system offers politicians little to no incentive to engage the public and even their constituents in conversations about policy issues between elections, notwithstanding the initiatives of individual politicians. And we call this institutional stubbornness. So together these two things contribute to what I would characterise as a non-deliberative model of representative democracy in Australia. So we're talking about formal democracy here. We're not talking about kitchen table conversations and so on. We're talking about formal institutions. It's non-deliberative. So our research wanted to understand whether that model of democracy matches the way that Australians think about democracy, imagine democracy, and especially the way that they imagine democracy at its best. And what we found is, well, I'll share a couple of highlights from the results that really speak to this directly. So we found that half of our respondents actually have what we would call a deliberative conception of democracy. So when we asked them how they think political decisions should be made, they said they should be made in close dialogue with citizens and affected groups. And we know that they rank, because we asked them to rank different options, they ranked that above the option of letting politicians or elected representatives decide on our behalf. They ranked it above letting experts decide on different issues, and they ranked it even above kind of more direct forms of democracy, so having more referendums and that sort of thing. So what that says to me is that Australians want more deliberation in their democracy than there currently is. But the second question, well, you might ask, well, that's all good and well, but people don't seem very motivated, and if there was opportunities to have conversation, would they participate? But we also asked people what they thought about deliberative forums as a way of letting regular citizens have input into political and policy making decisions. And in particular, forums that involve conversation between citizens, but also between citizens and elected representatives. And we asked them, if they were invited to participate in such a forum, would they do so? And 60% of our respondents said that they probably would. I think that finding was quite surprising in a very positive way. And I think it shows that generally there is a good amount of support in the wider public for more deliberation in our democracy.
Okay, so, but did your survey show that that support was across the board? Like most, I guess, traditions and historically most political and citizen engagement research tends to show that it skews to the richest people, the most educated and the most efficacious, the people who already feel confident in their capacity to have a say. Were you finding that too?
Yeah, we definitely found a slightly higher level of support for deliberation amongst people, amongst a certain archetype of person. So as you've described, more education, more economically secure, and interestingly, higher trust in government. So that's a really important point, because what it says to us is that this idea at the moment is most appealing to people who are already maybe more empowered and more engaged in politics. And it's less compelling at the moment to those who either face barriers to participation or who have a low level of trust in government and are cynical, perhaps. I don't think, as you said, I don't think it's surprising. It's fairly consistent with research that we do on political attitudes. I think what it does say is that, of course, if you're cynical about politics already, you're unlikely to say, yes, I support a new idea, because the cynicism just sort of prevents that. But I think it's a bit of a call to action. I think we need to keep talking about it. I think we need to build familiarity with the idea that our democracy could actually be more deliberative. I think we need to keep experimenting with forms of deliberative engagement like Selen's been talking about, and keep working with individual champions. And I'm pretty confident that if we do that, then the public support will follow.
I think that's a really important point, that it's in partnership or collaboration with the public, and that trust shouldn't be necessarily the barrier to engaging and including people. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we come to the second half and talk about potential solutions. But it's really interesting research, and I'm looking forward to seeing that in print as well. Adele, it's great stuff. So now I'm going to bring in Professor Andrea Carson, who's a Professor of Political Communication at Trobe University. She's conducted a lot of insightful research on journalism, fake news and digital media. But earlier this year, she released a couple of really significant reports on the Voice referendum, which really gives us a sense of, I guess, or a thermometer really of Australian democracy right now. So thinking a bit about Selen's positivity about deliberation and Adele's uncertainty around sort of trust and who we can engage, what do you think we learnt about Australian democracy throughout the Voice referendum?
It's a good starting point. I think it was a mixed bag, really. One of the things that I tend to look at is politics through the lens of the media. And so when the Voice to Parliament happened, a referendum that we haven't had for a very long time, and if you think back to the last referendum at the end of the 1990s, it was a very different media landscape to what it is today. There was no social media back in the 1990s. Most of us probably read the same sort of newspapers, watched the same television shows, and we could have a communal joint conversation, most likely with neighbours and so forth, because we didn't have a lot of choice. Now we're in a very high choice media environment, and it's the audience for the different options that we have has fragmented. So younger people, for example, are most likely to get their news and information on social media. If they're under 24, it's probably on TikTok. If they're older than 24 but under 35, it's probably Instagram. My generation, without wanting to give too much away, is probably still hanging on a little bit to linear television, the nightly news bulletin. Getting the newspapers online. Many people these days don't tend to read the printed version, but you get the picture that there's lots of different spaces. And the Voice to Parliament referendum was, I guess, a real challenge, because unlike elections where they're usually led by the centralised in terms of the campaign, referendums are decentralised. In the Voice to Parliament, there were a number of campaigns going on either side, and one of the things I started doing with colleagues was tracking the key actors during the Voice to Parliament, and we found that there was a lot of movement in the 12 months leading out. There was merging of groups coming together, and by the time we got into 2023, there were 3 distinct yes campaigns, and there was probably really only 2 no campaigns. There was the illusion that there was more no campaigns because they were funded by the same organisation but had different entities. So Advance Australia had set up Fair Australia, and That's Not My Voice. They were part of the same campaign, one led by Jacinta Price and the other by Warren Mundine. The distinction on the no side was the campaign set up by Lydia Thorpe, the senator who was with the Greens and then crossed over, who was diametrically opposed to the Voice for very different reasons to the Advance Australia campaigns. And then on the yes, there were at least 3 campaigns going on. And this matters because it means that they're competing for attention, for our attention, and they're using different mechanisms in order to get their message heard across the different platforms. No, we found, was a very sophisticated campaign. They had been doing focus groups at least 12 months out, had identified that division was going to be a very powerful word for them, and had honed that message by about November 2022. And that was around the same time that the Nationals said publicly that they wouldn't be supporting it. And as you will recall, the Voice to Parliament started off with 65% public support, and then it started to decline. It had a bit of a decline when the Nationals signalled there wouldn't be bipartisan support. And then by April, when Peter Dutton confirmed that the Liberals wouldn't be supporting it, we were tracking the polls as well and saw this real drop-off in support. So when we look at the media space and the different messages that were going on, we can see that it was a very noisy space, and perhaps as people turned their minds as it got closer towards the campaign, that high support was no longer there as it became more of a real prospect leading into the campaign. So what did we learn from that? We learnt that there was some very proficient messaging that was going on from the No campaign, that they were using the affordances of the different technologies very well. So for example, across the globe, short form videos become a very popular way to get through messaging, and we see that in the annual State of the Media reports that are done out of Oxford University across 40 countries. And the No campaign used that very effectively on TikTok, where the younger voters were, and on Instagram. The Yes campaign, because it was 3 different campaigns, were at one point we found they had 33 different messages compared to just 2 messages coming from the No campaign. And when you ask people who perhaps are not that engaged with the dynamics of the time, what the messages were that they're picking up on, they're unlikely to repeat back 33 messages, but it was very easy for them to repeat back the message that the voice would be divisive, or that if you don't know, vote no, which is a status quo messaging. Now, I did say it was a mixed bag, and I've just given you a lot of negativity. The positive side of this is that the barriers to entry have lowered. So you don't need to own a printing press or run a radio show or have access to a television studio in order to be able to convey a message. And we saw some grassroots messaging that was very effective on TikTok. One that comes to mind is some representatives out of the Victorian Trade Union movement that did some funny using humour effectively in their short form videos. So if you're effective at the messaging, you can use the fragmented landscape and the diverse landscape to be able to get attention, but it is a very competitive environment.
I think the points that you're making there, Andrea, are really important, both about the high choice and diverse media environment we have. It's very harder for any political actor to control in a top-down way because of that dispersal. Also suggesting to me that the referendum's a really important political moment in Australia that we're all going to be thinking about for a very long time, in terms of partly about explaining what happened, and because there were also, as you said, negatives and positives. There were clearly, these new campaign organisations were mobilising people on the ground. They were getting them to talk about the debate. Maybe they weren't getting them to deliberate inclusively with one another or listen to one another. And I think that's something we'll need to think about in the longer term. With something like a referendum that's so binary, a good vehicle for us to really think about encouraging deliberation and inclusion as well. But it's one that we will keep coming back to. Did you want to talk at all about sort of politicians and their use of particular media as well? I think about Sky News was an important player too.
Yeah, I just might pick up on that prior point that you made first about how much deliberation was going on. So we did a number of projects with the Voice to Parliament, but one of them was gathering 3.3 million social media posts and news stories. And we were able to use some computational methods to identify what the major themes were that were coming out of this huge, massive, different spaces. And what we found was that there was, when we graphed this up we found 45 distinct sort of narratives that were coming out, and I've already spoken about the really prominent ones. But we found that there wasn't so much echo chambers that you often hear about, that the Yes and the No campaigns were interacting on some of the key narratives, but it was almost like an argument. So we would see, perhaps to give you an example, one that was very clear in the data, and that was the No campaign arguing that the Voice to Parliament was like an apartheid, that it would separate Australians. And so we'd see this dialogue surge in our graphs that we were able to map. And then we'd see the Yes campaign come in and argue against that. So it was like a kind of helix, and up and down, that once No had some momentum, Yes would negate that message, and then it would it would slow down, and No would pick it up again, and then Yes would respond. So on one hand, we're seeing that there wasn't so much echo chambers going on. There was robust debate, perhaps argument, with the yes and no backwards and forwards on these different types of narratives that were running through. But I think it was quite polarised. And I think polarisation is quite different to echo chambers, that people were talking past each other. And so on the point of leaders and politicians, I think people were looking for leadership beyond this more flattened sort of hierarchy that was coming from the grassroots movement. And we did see a lot of leadership coming from the coalition. And one of the ways that that showed itself was when we look at the quantum of comments. Peter Dutton was frequently talking about The Voice, but was also, the coalition was paying for paid advertising with particular politicians that we see in the Facebook ad library, putting their own name to it and making it their particular issue. We didn't see the equivalent going on for the Labor side. And I find this quite curious because at the same time we see Anthony Albanese paying for ads on other issues, whether it be on, I can't think of one at the moment, but on particular policy issues, but was silent on the Voice to Parliament during this time. And I think one of the things we think about as political scientists is the role that elites play in sending cues to the public about where they should position themselves on an issue. And because it wasn't strictly partisan with left, right, like an election is, I think there was this real need for elites to be able to signal to people that supported them where they were standing, and some of that space was missing.
Yeah, like I said, well, we're going to keep talking about it for years. There's lots of complexity there around the role of leadership, the role of shaping narratives, and how we bring people into the discussion as well.
The media were not neutral actors in this. Ariadne said at the beginning about some of the crises that democracies are facing, and one in particular that Australia is not immune from is that we have low trust in the media, and we also have low trust in politicians. But the media is not one homogenous block. When we break down to all the different forms, particular mastheads, television, we see that the ABC usually has relatively high trust, and then at the lower end are usually the blogs and some of the more tabloid media. And what we found with the Voice to Parliament was that Sky News, when we break down and look at these various narratives, they were running very strongly on about 5 of the negative narratives. And so much so that they would invite politicians in to speak on them. They would then use those stories and cut them up into little videos, put them onto YouTube. And often they would have a kind of an American theme around them, like the rigged election or stolen election, or other sort of tropes that are more global. And they were getting an enormous audience on the YouTube environment by doing this. At one point, we mapped that had 19 million views. But the other part that's interesting about that is once you get over 10,000 views, they start to attract advertising revenue. So there's a real economic incentive to be inciting this tension that captures people's, the more sensational it is, the more likely it is to get attention, and it has an economic imperative behind it.
Okay, so before we get all very depressed about the dominance of clickbait, and I guess have more of a think about, I guess, how we might have agency and might be able to shape democracy in Australia to be more engaging for people. So Adele, I'm going to turn to you first. About your research also has a sense of what is the path forward to promote deliberative democracy in Australia.
Yeah, and I think just hearing Andrea reflect on the referendum, makes me all the more feel like it's all the more urgent that we enhance the quality of deliberation in our democracy. And I think that the point that you just made at the end, Andrea, about like we don't leave people alone to navigate like this incredibly complex divisive, polarised information environment, and then ask them to make a good decision, a good judgment about a yes and no question, which is already really, really difficult. So I think, we need to really start thinking about how we support people better in making decisions, because making decisions is effectively, as I said earlier, the main form of participation that we have in our democracy, making decisions in elections or referendums. But yeah, to your question, Ariadne, I think, in terms of thinking of the pathways forward, I think we need to, think about why deliberative democracy and deliberative forms of engagement are worth promoting. They're not just good in theory, they actually hold the key to restoring public confidence in our democratic system. And quite frankly, as we've said, we really need that. People are more disenchanted than they've ever been. They feel more disconnected than they ever have. And we only have to look overseas to see where the pathway leads when your democratic system loses legitimacy. It's dangerous, and I for one, don't want to head down that path. At the same time, I think people have good reason to have lost confidence in our democratic system. I think there are, very, very reasonable grounds on which people have disconnected and disengaged. And so, and the sort of toxic, polarising, divisive elite messaging is just one of them. So deliberative, I'm not here saying that deliberative democracy is the kind of silver bullet to all of our woes in democracy, because it certainly is not. But it's a tool in the toolbox that I am pretty confident should be part of the solution. And I'll tell you why I'm confident. Because in our survey, we also did an experiment where we divided our respondents into groups. And one of the groups read a news story about a parliamentary committee that was thinking about how to tackle a particular issue. And they operated like the parliamentary committee process operates right now. So they had a public submission process. They received a couple of hundred written submissions from lobby groups of one kind or another. But another group of our respondents read a news story about a parliamentary committee that was also thinking about tackling the same issue. But the parliamentary committee convened a citizens panel, and the citizens panel deliberated over some time on the issue and then delivered a set of recommendations to the committee about how to tackle the issue. And we then asked those people in both groups how fair they thought the process was and how trustworthy they believed that the recommendations from the process were. And what we found was that in the second scenario, so the second treatment, the people who got the information about the citizens panel, they thought that the process was fairer and that the recommendations were more trustworthy than the people who got the process which reflects the status quo process that we have now. And really importantly here, thinking again about people with low levels of trust, that effect held across the board. So that means that even people who might have previously said, I don't support deliberative forums for one reason or another, because they've got a low level of trust in government, they're cynical, their confidence was boosted when they read a story about Parliament using a deliberative tool, a deliberative forum with citizens to help them think about how to tackle a particular issue. There's one caveat to this though that's really important, because we had a third group of people who read a news story about a parliamentary committee that had a citizens panel, and the committee ignored the recommendations of the panel. And what we found was that those people lost confidence. Their confidence became even lower than the confidence of the people who read about the status quo. So in other words, it made things worse. So I think, in kind of trying to sum up what that all means, I think it means that institutional forms of deliberation have the potential to help boost confidence in our democratic system and help build the legitimacy of the parliament in the eyes of the public. But a central and indispensable component of that is that politicians genuinely listen to the outcomes of citizens' deliberation, because if it's just tokenistic, it actually makes things worse.
That's a really, really powerful point about the both the risks, but also that there needs to be that reciprocity and listening between citizens and political decision makers. It's fascinating research. Thanks so much, Adele. Selen, what are your thoughts about how we can promote deliberative democracy in Australia and change things around?
I just want to say something on the voice briefly before we move on to the proposals. It was such a lost opportunity, I think, for Australia. And also, I think it's a kind of a democratic exercise that also, again, for me, brings the relevance of more deliberative forms of citizen engagement, because we see there are examples of combining referendums with deliberative engagements. Yeah. There are examples of citizens' initiative reviews, for example, we have published on this with John Dreisek, who is in the room. The point there is, I guess, when we think about deliberative democracy or deliberative engagement, we tend to think about talking, voice, but deliberative engagement is also about listening and reflection. It's also about cutting the noise in the public sphere, creating those spaces where we can listen, synthesize information, maybe tackle dis and misinformation. And I think in the context of the voice referendum, I haven't done research on that, but as an Australian citizen who observed this, I think those spaces were missing where a more meaningful response could be crafted. And then, you know, the referendums can be more meaningful as well if they are coupled with deliberative forms of citizen engagement. So going forward, I think I want to keep my optimism. So, and this event is part of UC's research festival as well. So we need to celebrate research and celebrate some optimism, some level of optimism as well. I think, first of all, it's important that we change the way we talk about politics and we approach politics. Again, in Australia, I think I see a lot of adversarial politics being dominant and shaping the way we talk about democracy and politics as well. It's about winners versus losers. It's about the two-party system. It's about winning the next election, not about solving the common problems. And I think this, again, brings the deliberative perspective. It's not about winning the elections. It's about solving the common problems. And we have plenty of those problems. And I also, going forward, I see lots of practitioners, organizations being part of the ecosystem of deliberative community in Australia. There is, for example, a new organization based in Sydney, Amplify. I think they are doing some great work. They identified some areas, policy areas that are controversial and important to address, and they are trying to address those issues through deliberative community engagement. So it's important that we look at these examples. We try to shift the way we talk about democracy and politics and focus maybe on our commonalities that we have with others. And then I think it's also important to institutionalize these kind of practices, to provide space in our institutions for deliberative engagement, to make this kind of engagement a part of business as usual. But of course, this requires resources as well. This requires capacity. And we know, for example, in Australia, we've been maybe a little bit disappointed in the federal politics. We didn't see any deliberative initiative coming at the federal level in recent years, or overall, I guess. But there are lots of examples of successful forms of deliberative engagement at the local level, at the state level. So these are really important initiatives. And I know, for example, in Victoria, deliberative engagement is now part of Local Government Act. So if you are going to do anything related to community vision or plan, there has to be a deliberative engagement. But we also hear that the word is there, but it's not being unpacked. What does it mean? Is it resource? Who is going to do this deliberative engagement? So I think it is important to look at the positive examples, spaces where deliberative engagement is being institutionalized, plus resourced, not only in funding terms, but also in terms of know-how. So I think these are important steps that I see as going forward, shaping the prospects of deliberative democracy in Australia.
Thanks so much, Selen. There are a lot of really important points there about the sort of adversarial nature of politics in Australia and how you can shift that to be a lot more consensus-driven or based on our common ground or our shared problems that we want to solve. And I think that's a really, really important point, that it is a political culture shift we're talking about, as well as there being political will to resource and support those ideas. And you're right to say that state and local governments are pioneering these mechanisms. Victoria and South Australia are both leading spaces. And even when you talked about the referendum, it did remind me that Ireland, you know, once conservative Catholic country, which also had very adversarial politics, led the world in running citizens' assemblies before major referendums on abortion and marriage equality law reform that really fundamentally changed the society and institutionalised deliberative mechanisms. You know, there are ongoing tweaks and questions about it, but it is a different political culture now. So I think your points are really important. So now I'm going to ask Andrea if she can be a little bit optimistic about the role of the media as agents of deliberation and creating different spaces. And no, this won't just be a paid advertisement for public broadcasting either. I think we can talk broadly about that too.
Well, if you would let me, I'd just like to pick up on a point about the Westminster system, which I think shouldn't be overlooked, and that is that now for the last 10, 12 years, Australians are moving away from voting for the two major parties, and a third of us now put our vote with smaller parties or independents. And the reason I bring this up is it was no accident, I think, that there was, at the last federal election, rise in the number of independents and the Teals. Many of them were women who, well, all of them actually, except at the Senate level. And it was all of the Teals that recorded yes votes in their electorates during the Voice to Parliament. And I think that speaks to the point that you were making about listening being a really important part of deliberative democracy and of engagement, that it's not just about pushing a message out, but also about listening to the electorates. And for the Teals, they did a lot of campaigning. It was almost like a midterm election for them to re-engage with their constituents. And one of the things that they do particularly well is large field campaigns, where they have some people who've never been involved in politics before, happy to wear their T-shirts and knock on doors and support the messages that they had. And that was true also with the Voice to Parliament, and that's where you did see a yes vote returned. Now, I know I'm talking to the only in polity here that had an overall yes vote, and that was the ACT. But those individual electorates of the Teals also recorded that. In terms of a positive space with the media, well, I think there's a lot of challenges there, Ariadne. Yeah. One thing is that the business model for traditional media has been broken for some time, and there was some hope that getting money from the large tech companies of Google and Facebook, where Australia did world first legislation of the News Media Bargaining Code that was legislated in 2021. That was looking like a high tide moment. It brought in $200 million in the first year, and places like The Guardian hired another 50 journalists off the back of that. But now Facebook has pulled away from participating in the News Media Bargaining Code. In Canada, where other countries were looking to Australia, up to 6 or 7 countries were looking to adopt similar legislation. Canada was the most advanced, did adopt it. Facebook's completely pulled out of news in that space. So where does that leave us? And it's an open question, because we might see something similar happening in Australia now that Facebook has decided not to participate in the News Media Bargaining Code. We are heading into a federal election, so we may not see anything in the next 6 months, but there are tensions brewing between government and between the tech platforms about what's going to happen to this piece of legislation that is almost dead in the water at the moment. Now that matters because without extra revenue, news organisations find it very difficult to staff their newsrooms to the levels that they have in the past, which means that we're not getting specialist reporting in those beat rounds that journalists are trying to do more with less. And that's where there's a tendency to go for low-hanging fruit, easier to get stories, and in turn, audiences see that and that reduces trust in the media. But what we do have is a national broadcaster that has a charter, and in that charter is embedded the need for fairness and impartiality. And I think given the contrast of what's transpired in America, which is a very polarised society that doesn't have an overarching national media, that's something that we should be celebrating. And I think the other thing, and I'm sure Adele can speak to this too, that we can celebrate in Australia is having compulsory voting, which means that we do have to lean in and engage at some point, because we do have to vote, and it also makes it much harder to appeal to those fringes with more radical positions, which again, in contrast to the US, it doesn't have that environment, and they only have to mobilise, I think, what was the turnout, about 62% at the last election, only getting half of that, 30%, in order to get a national outcome. So they're two, I think, positives that we should be thankful for in this nation.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And I think now that we've listened to my expert colleagues talking about their world-leading research and ideas, and we've been talking about how we can bring ideas, theoretical often ideas about deliberation, into real-world practice that affects people's lives. It's been really important. So thank you, three of you. I'm going to say thank you to three speakers. You're all brilliant, and I've got lots of things to go away and think about as well, about how we bring all of these perspectives together. But now we've probably got about 20 minutes or so for the audience who've been very good listening to us talking about deliberation and how we can improve Australian democracy. So I think we have a microphone over here, so don't be shy. If you have a question for the panel, questions rather than long statements, preferably, that would be fantastic.
Hi, thank you for a fantastic panel. I'm Laura Davey. I'm a lecturer in public policy from the ANU. So it's an exciting thing that there's so much renewed interest in words like deliberation, participation, engagement, co-design amongst government. But I think sort of hand in hand with that, there's been also a rise perhaps in misunderstanding or misapplication of those terms, which can contribute to what Dr. Webb has described as, the lack of trust and the cynicism towards government. So my question is, what are some strategies for combating the misinformation in the realms of the decision makers around what these terms really mean, and how can we preserve the meaningfulness of, say, real deliberation, something that's beyond a simple feedback exercise or consultation?
I guess we are trying to do this through our engagement with the public servants, for example, but with those who are interested in engaging with research and research insights. I think we need to also publish our research in ways that are understandable and that can be translated and have an impact in those worlds as well. I think we don't see this happening very often. I think the academics should put more work into their translation efforts to translate the ideas and make them more accessible to broader publics, showing the relevance of these ideas. Sometimes when you talk to public servants or people in practice, and they don't engage with the idea of deliberative democracy, and they say, we are doing this already. And then when we ask, okay, how are you doing this? They say, well, we have a web platform. There's a have your say box there, and they see this as a form of deliberation. So I think it's important for us to challenge those minimalist, thin understandings of deliberation. As I said, okay, have your say, and then what happens after that? So, and think about, try to broaden the understanding of deliberation beyond articulating, expressing one's opinion, but also reflection, also about listening, and also about talking to each other. Sometimes also some organizations, for example, they do a survey. Surveys are efficient ways of finding out what the majority of the public is thinking about and what they want to happen. And they think this is enough of a citizen input. So we are engaging with citizens, we are doing surveys, we know how many % of the public wants what. So again, I think for us, we have to engage with these existing practices of community engagement and try to find ways to make them more deliberative. Sometimes it's easier to take the existing practice and compare it with the kind of practice that is desirable. To make the point. So I think more engagement between researchers and practitioners is key, more effort on the side of the academics to translate their ideas in ways that are accessible, relevant, and meaningful to those so that the engagement can continue for both parts.
So I'm Fiona Dyer and I'm a professor in water science, which is a fairly contested space at the University of Canberra. My question is, what processes need to be put in place to ensure that very well organised single interest groups don't hijack the deliberative process, become the only voice in the conversation? How do you get the diversity of voices in those conversations to enable a true wide conversation to happen around these things?
Yeah, well, I can begin to answer you, and perhaps Selen can fill the gaps. I mean, the good thing about deliberative spaces usually is they're not it's not an opt-in exercise. So it's not a case of saying, so if we think about it in terms of a town hall, we've often, talked about, politicians have town halls and it becomes like a raucous and everyone yells and really the loudest person yells and mostly the kind of gentle people leave because it's just too noisy. A deliberative town hall has people in the room who've been chosen to represent a cross-section of the population. So no particular group should be have more persuasion in that room than the person next to them. But also, I think it sort of goes to the point about the parliamentary committee that I was talking about earlier and the processes that we do have. Because, I mean, lobby groups is a massive problem, and you obviously know that because you're asking the question about it. And what's interesting is that if you look at the kind of parliamentary website, it quite proudly sort of boasts that the committee process is a great example of where the Parliament gets public input on sometimes contentious or really tricky issues where there's clear trade-off that needs to be made and sort of weighing up of pros and cons. And that kind of this sort of format of written submissions and then a travelling hearing where you invite people to come and speak to their submission is a really great way. See, we get public input, aren't we doing well? But I think that process shows just how lopsided even a process which the Parliament thinks is about citizen input can be. So, I mean, that's why this is just a hypothetical example, but for example, having a citizens panel in that committee process where it's not the lobby groups who get to, write their submissions with the people who get paid to do that on behalf of the lobby group, but it could be you, me, anyone in the room and talking to each other and generating ideas which could not have existed without that group of people together in that generative exercise, thinking about the problem, listening to each other's experiences, hearing someone who thinks differently to you, reflecting on that, not necessarily ever agreeing with them, but perhaps seeing that there's some part of what you think that could moderate to try and understand more the way that someone else is thinking. So yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I've answered your question, but I think this is a massive problem. the influence of lobby groups is definitely a barrier to more deliberation. Yeah.
Okay, but all of the panel want to have a response to this as well. So Andrea, do you want to go, and then Selen?
I think there's a time urgent aspect to this, and I'll give an example, a time urgent aspect as to why we need to be innovative in this space. So the Mis and Disinformation Bill, which has just gone back before the Parliament this week, had over 25,000 submissions in response to it when it was a draft bill at the beginning, and I see some raised eyebrows, and so you should, because that's a lot. Most of them were bots and automated submissions, and this is really problematic in the age of generative AI, which is evolving at a rapid pace. How easy it is to game some of these systems. And I think that's a really important reason why we need to have innovation, so that it's not being controlled by single lobbies or those with nefarious purposes.
Thanks, Andrea.
So Fiona, thanks for your question. Two quick responses. The first one is, yes, diversity in a deliberative forum has been a very important issue, and there are different strategies to enable diverse views to come together in the context of a deliberative forum. Our colleagues at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance are doing some groundbreaking work on the notion of representation. They have developed the notion of discursive representation. The idea is to understand different positions on an issue that already exists in the public sphere, and trying to make sure that the deliberative forum is representative of those views. So I see these kind of innovative approaches as one way forward to enable diversity and to enable that we don't always sort of interact with the usual suspects in those forums. Having said that, I also want to say this, that diversity, there are also situations that you don't want diversity. There are also issues where you need to create a safe space and bring together similarly situated individuals to find their collective voice, to find their preferences. So this is called enclave deliberation in deliberative democracy scholarship, where we talk about homogeneous groups, but this is also important. It's important to create those safe spaces for people to feel comfortable. And then maybe this safe space can be part of a larger process, or then maybe a representative from that safe space could go and mix with other groups in a more diverse composition of a deliberative forum. So there is a lot of thinking in deliberative democracy about diversity and how to facilitate diversity, but also there are situations that you don't want diversity.
Thank you very much to you, the group who've put this discussion on. Deliberative democracy is absolutely vital to us at this moment. My own view and the view of the Council for the Human Future, of which I'm a member, and I'm also a member of the committee of the Canberra Alliance for Participatory Democracy. We are deeply concerned about the future survival of humanity. And that's taken a step further back following the American election, I think. I would ask you, what do you feel deliberative democracy can do in Australia to set us on a different path? And I would draw your attention to the work that the Council for the Human Future has done about an Earth System Charter, which we are trying to get the Foreign Affairs Minister to consider taking a stance on behalf of Australia in the United Nations.
Well, what could deliberative democracy do that could get Australia ahead? I think I will, for example, give one example. So one of the pressing issues in politics is how to think about and involve future generations in political decision making today for the issues that affect future generations. deliberative democracy offers a platform, for example, for decision makers to take into account the interests of future generations. So deliberative democracy could in that way offer a more future-proofed way of decision making. I think this is important, and it's important in the context of the climate crisis as well as intergenerational equity issues in Australia. So we have to think about the future generations, and deliberative democracy offers that pathway. Another line of research that my colleagues are pursuing at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance is how do we include non-humans in our decision making? How do we make our democratic process, how do we make political decisions more inclusive in ways that is also sensitive to the nature, that's also sensitive to the animals. So I think I don't see any other decision-making method or consultation method that takes into account these kind of questions in a way that deliberative democracy does. So these are just, I guess, two examples to expand our thinking and to make our I guess thinking more creative in this space as well in terms of what could we get more out of deliberative democracy.
Yeah, and I might just add to that if I may. I think the ideas that we've been talking about tonight and the ideas that are kind of central to deliberative democracy as a theory, they're really productive and useful in the space of civic education. When you think of our young people and you think of well, actually, the quite limited civic education that we get in schools, but you know, students are sort of taught something about politics and something about political engagement. But from my experience, it's fairly limited. And when they're not being taught, what they see is if they switch the television on or they go for their school excursion to Canberra, they see question time in Parliament, and it's anything but kind of abiding by the principles of good deliberation. So, you know, if you think about inclusivity, respectfulness, reflectiveness, listening, and trying to find common ground, none of those things really jump out when we think about question time. So the model that we're giving them is actually just to argue, like Andrea was saying about the referendum, to debate, but even more than debate, just argue. And deliberation is distinct from argument, and it's distinct from debate because it involves that level of reflection and therefore reflexivity on the part of the participants to think about what someone else says and what does that mean in terms of what I think and what I could think. Do I want to change my mind? No, that's all right too, but I've heard what someone else thinks and I've considered whether I want to change my mind, and it's either helped me to shape more clearly what I think and I'm still in my position, or I've shifted a little bit. And so wouldn't it be great if our high school students and even our primary school students learnt the art again of talking to each other and disagreeing without arguing aggressively and in a very, I'm going to say it, a very male aggressive way. I think, you know, there's a lot that we can bring to our education system when we think about these kind of principles and norms. And I've got young kids and that's what I want them to learn. I don't want them to watch Question Time. It's far too adversarial and aggressive, yeah.
And on that note, I'd probably give a vote too for independent, robust media so that the issue agenda is expanded and we're not just talking about a handful of topics, that issues that are important to you get due consideration. And one way to do that is to ensure that media's funded, public interest journalism, I'm speaking about specifically, is adequately funded. There are some schemes that are occurring in Australia at the moment. There's some government funding in the regions because there's a dearth of independent media there, but there needs to be something more sustainable to ensure that we do have those robust public spaces to be able to consider a broad range of issues.
Our lucky last question of the night.
Hello, my question is, what strategies can be used to design deliberative democracy in a way that engages and includes young people, especially those who are disengaged or identify as apolitical, which I think is very common in Australia?
Well, the first thing I would say is include young people right at the beginning. I find it really frustrating when we talk about young people, and often you see this on shows like Q&A, and there's no young person on the panel. So I think a good starting point is if you're going to have that conversation, bring in the people that we're speaking about and to at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Dennis, do you like my idea about civic education incorporating deliberative norms? Maybe you can be our market research in this forum because you're at high school. Yeah, I mean, I think if you, I think it's also a mind shift. It's not just kind of like what do we do in practice. It's also a mind shift on the part of us all, but also of our political elites and our elites in general in society to care more about what young people think, and actually to see young people as a generative source of good new ideas, and not just as kind of, you know, people who haven't yet formed opinions that are worth listening to, which I think is maybe not quite what they think, but that's the sense that I think young people get, and that's why they tune out. So I think, you know, more genuine kind of interest and engagement with young people in what they think would be a good start, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's important to be context specific and understand what young people are about and what they like doing, what they dislike. Because I think if you bring a group of young people in a deliberative forum that looks like a lecture theater, you're not going to engage them. So we have to be creative. We have to think about the ways young people like engaging with politics, and we need to capitalize those to get the most out of their involvement as well as to give them a meaningful experience. I mean, I know some climate assemblies in Europe, they engage kids as young as, I think, primary school kids as part of their deliberative process. And they are using a lot of play, drawings, and art as part of deliberative engagement. So it's important, again, to be context specific to understand what would be attractive for this group of people, and be creative with the design of the processes rather than using one size fits all across all different kind of groups.
Yeah. Thanks, Selen. I think that's a really lovely place to end this discussion on, with thinking about the future, thinking about intergenerational equity, what we owe for the future generations and for young people, and how we, I guess, model that listening and inclusive and deliberative relationship amongst people as well. So thank you again to Selen, Andrea and Adele for a great discussion, and thank you to the audience for coming tonight. I really appreciate you being here. So thank you.